Hello, and welcome to APICS Extra Live, the future of S&OP with Patrick Bauer. My name is Jennifer Storelli, Associate Editor at APICS. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few details. At the end of the presentation, we will save time for a question and answer session. If you look at the right toolbar on your screen, you'll see a questions box. To ask your question at any time during the presentation, simply type it in the box and click send. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's broadcast, please call GoToWebinar Tech Support at 1-805-617-7000. Again, that's 1-805-617-7000. This presentation is being recorded and will be available at apics.org/extralive starting early next week. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Patrick Bauer is the Senior Director of Global Supply Chain Planning and Customer Service for Combe. He is responsible for the company's sales and operations planning process, order management, third-party logistics management, demand planning, and supply planning. Everybody, please give a warm welcome to Patrick Bauer. Patrick, you may begin.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks to APICS for sort of making this webinar available. I am probably the only bullet points I'll talk about on the bio is I am a self-professed S&OP nerd, and I've discovered that I used to call myself an S&OP geek, and I found out that geeks are people that collect things like Star Wars action figures, so I've now graduated to nerd. I work for Combe. Combe makes some products that most people have heard of: Aquavelva, Just for Men, Vagisil, Williams Mug Soap, and things like that. We are health and beauty and CPG. The intent and purpose of this webinar is really to create a dialogue or begin a dialogue about what's going to happen over the next 10 years with the S&OP process, mainly based on what's happening right now. What are the prevailing trends? Sort of what are the hot topics? I don't want to sound like The View here, but what are the hot topics that are now impacting a lot of people? And when I talk to peers and colleagues, what are they talking about as they go conference to conference? It is certainly a practitioner's viewpoint. I don't represent a software company, or I'm not a talking head, an industry analyst. It's a practitioner's viewpoint, but I think a practitioner that has his ear to the rail. And are there eurekas in the presentation? There may be a few, maybe a couple things that you haven't heard of that are going on right now. But I really think there's probably a lot more collective commiseration. And there actually is benefit in knowing that you're not the only one experiencing some of the things that are happening in the S&OP world and seeing some of the things that are happening in the supply chain world. So there's some sort of benefit that in knowing that other peoples are experiencing the same. And you know, it's fine because I've had some preliminary conversations with people about the presentation, and some of the feedback I got back was similar to, that's exactly what I've been thinking is happening, and if there's confidence building in that it's worthwhile of it by itself. There's you know, 8 or 9 pretty important topics and things that are starting to happen, or trends that are emerging, or dynamics that are happening in the S&OP world, and I've tried to put them in some logical buckets so they flow together well. The first topic, and this is probably the least exciting of them on the surface, but really if you dig deep into it, it's pretty cool. For the very first time, there's a considerable amount of academic research going into the field, and you know, there's actually efforts underway. There's papers being written. I've been asked to peer review a couple of them, but there's actually people out there right now trying to do academic research on S&OP, and S&OP is, you know, just when you think it's hitting critical mass, it grows and expands. APICS has a feature inside of its magazine. You're now seeing academic research. It's developing a different type of critical mass. It's going outside the bounds of business, and it's expanding its footprint. And once you start getting the academia sort of digging in and submitting it to peer-reviewed journals, you'll start getting more than just the collective opinion of people that have been around. You'll actually get statistical-based research that will help derive what really makes S&OP successful. What are the precursors that are necessary? What are the real benefit streams you get from doing sort of a low maturity process versus a high maturity process? And what are the most effective measures to use within the process? And these are just sort of examples. But imagine just sort of a whole series, hundreds of little research projects that will be tweaking around the edges of the S&OP process model. I think once these papers start getting accepted, research will spawn other research, and I think insight will explode. And I think we'll know a lot more about S&OP over the next 10 years than we've known over the last 30. Textbooks, coursework, case studies. I can imagine a capstone class for supply chain management majors. And it's kind of weird to think about it, but I don't think anyone ever said, I want to be an S&OP lead. And S&OP might actually start becoming a destination profession. I've often said that most people that end up in supply chain don't necessarily plan to be there. It's never a destination profession when you're a 17 or 18-year-old kid in high school trying to figure out what you want to do next. S&OP might, and supply chain management in general, might become much more of a destination profession. And that's all good. That means we'll have college graduates who will come out and not just know supply chain management, but S&OP conceptually. And S&OP gives you a much broader footprint and understanding of what's happening, a much more expansive view of the complete supply chain. So while it may sound like, oh, you know, it's just going to be a bunch of knuckleheads writing on S&OP, this is really in-depth research, and it's well-cited research, and I'm excited by this. I think it's sort of the next step change inside of our profession. When that happens, there's going to be a whole bunch of unification of standards. You know, if you look at the screenshot at the bottom, what I literally did was went to Google and I typed in S&OP and I did images, and I did a screenshot of just some of the different process models and maturity models and representations of how S&OP is and what it is. And I think what we're going to get to with the academic research, and as people write textbooks and whatever, is we'll actually get to much more standard maturity models, nomenclatures, naming conventions. What's an immature state? What's a stage one? You tell me the descriptor that's otherwise used from maturity or process steps or whatever. I think all of those will become much more fluid and common. It'll also start taking out sort of marketing-based process names or legacy process names. SIOP has been around seemingly forever. You know, inventory has always been included as part of an S&OP element. I'm not sure why the I is necessarily needed. And I've joked personally that IBP stands I've been played. It's kind of marketing hype. It's nothing more than a very mature S&OP process model. I think when we start pulling back and get to standardization, we get to a place where people can't marketing hype and make something out of something that just frankly isn't. And you know, I've been a big proponent that over time we need to get to something similar to what developers did with like Unix or maybe even the SCORE model. You get to sort of an open source S&OP where there's not a lot of proprietary gobbledygook running around out there. There's really a shared platform of process content and design. And I mean, if we get this, I think you want to talk about mind share growing and standardization and understanding of what the process is, and without having to try and interpret through other people's languages or, you know, the Tom Wallace camp or the Ollie White camp or anyone else's camp that's out there. It'll become very uniform. And I offer this aside. When I worked for a company and we did S&OP implementations, and someone logically came up to me and said, Pat, you speak so much about a reality-based S&OP. Why don't we rename S&OP to be a reality-based process? And I'm like, well, that's what it already is. And I kind of stifled that conversation. I think the standardization will help stifle other conversations similar to that. The academic research will also help do something that is sort of has always been one of those suspect things. How do you actually define the benefit stream associated with doing anything inside of S&OP? What do you get out of it? And it's funny, I had an email dialogue with Tom Wallace maybe about 5 or 6 months ago, and he said something to the extent like most people's S&OP processes are in the black. And I think that was an important statement, because we all try and derive these sort of grand and glorious benefits out of S&OP, but just by starting the process and making progress along with it, you're going to start making a difference and start realizing benefit streams. I think the academic research will help determine what the best levers are and what are success factors that will help you cash out the money out of the process. There's also sort of sketchy benefits out there, and I've heard people say, well, 1% per performance improvement and in demand planning will lead to a 1% improvement in inventory. I've never seen that, and it's certainly suspect. It really varies by company and type of business model that they have and production and distribution network that they have. But I think that as you start researching and you start getting into individual niche industries, you start seeing where those opportunities to get benefit are. And inventory may not be the opportunity, but maybe production utilization is, or maybe fill is the opportunity. I think you end up finding that out, and I think the focus on S&OP from an academic perspective will create a body of work that will actually show us the money. And while I'm on Jerry Maguire, I had to put something with Tom Cruise, and you had me at benefit streams. Sort of shifting gears from the academic research, I'm really hoping that this happens, that this one would, as much as the academic research gets me excited, I think the building out of a comprehensive S&OP suite is also one of those things that I would love to see. I've actually tried to organize people so that we had a Rev 1.0 of S&OP software, that we define it so that software companies can build to it. Now, I should probably step back. I worked inside of Numetrics, a supply chain management company, 15 years ago, and maybe even further back. Maybe it's 20 years ago now. I implemented their software when I was at Kraft. And I was a VP of R&D for a software company, so I love software. I'm a big fan that software can really make a difference and improve quality of decision making. The problem is I see a lot of software out there. I go to conferences and I look at every booth and I go and I say there's not a lot of software that I think is S&OP ready. I think there's bits and pieces and parts. I think there's dashboards and KPI tools, certainly data mining. There are some people that do rough cut capacity planning and scenario planning. There's folks that have a little bit of a workflow. And there's some people that think that S&OP is really kind of collaborative demand planning, where you have multiple rows where people could enter input. I'm not sure that any of them sort of meets my tolerance test for what an S&OP process model should look like as laid out in software. I think there are some people that are close. There's some people very close in niches. I think there's a combination of, it's sort of like the old supply chain software guys. Some of them were kind of build your own toolkit type of approach, and some of them are more packagey. I'm always reminded of Numetric having a very package-oriented solution, while Chesapeake, I believe, had a very toolkit-oriented approach. They solved the same problem, but one of them allowed more customization. I think that there's a whole group of people out there saying that they do S&OP. Some of them do it okay. Some of them really don't even understand what it is. And I know that because I'll ask them for what some people will call the PSI or the SDI graph, which is sort of a classic representation of inventory demand over time. And most of them don't even know what I'm talking about. And trust me, I'm not trying to catch them out in that conversation. So no one has a perfect tool set. Again, some people are very, very good within a niche, and I can, if someone wants to ask me who's good in a niche afterwards, I'm very happy to talk about that specifically. I'm actually hoping that there's some technological Darwinism that will otherwise kick in. And I always go back to what happened in the mid-90s in the supply chain management software sector. It was amazing. And I think the competitive forces between the likes of Numetrics and Chesapeake and Manugistics and I2 and all those folks back then, I think the competitive forces ended up building out some really wonderful products. And I'm hoping that competitive forces in the S&OP space and with the idea that they'll hopefully end up looking and feeling like a suite will help really drive some of the future tool sets. Right now, if I talk to people and when I go to conferences like the APICS Best of the Best or an IBF conference, a lot of the people are still saying that they exist in some sort of Excel ghetto to support S&OP. And when you start asking even more deeper dive questions like how many actually feel like scenario planning tools are real or realistic or usable, only 8% will say that, literally 8% is the number, will say that they have a scenario planning tool that works well for them. And if you're not scenario planning inside of S&OP, you've kind of missed the boat. The other dynamic that's happening, it's quasi-technical, is that S&OP is becoming much more virtual, and this creates a whole set of a whole problem set unto itself. Certainly, I think everyone knows that, especially companies that are more service-oriented are certainly doing a lot more hoteling. And the Big Four accounting firm, Amex and GSA, are always sort of called out as entities that are doing a lot of hoteling. But telecommuting is expanding, and I was surprised at these numbers. First, they've doubled. It's 3.7 million U.S. workers are currently telecommuting. Most of them are knowledge workers. It's 2.5% of the workforce. So a lot of professional staff right now are telecommuting. This creates challenges in the S&OP world that I think are really misunderstood or understated. And it's going to get worse as this trend continues to grow. I think you start looking at, first, the timing of meetings in a global context. If you're trying to do something that's global from an S&OP perspective, becomes an issue. Finding the right time of the day, either someone's up really late or really early on the opposite end of the world to have a global S&OP meeting. So that always poses some sort of problem. It also, as we get to more and more telecommuting, the interpersonal relationships that are built and trust that's built can be lost. If you're not seeing someone every day at the water cooler or grabbing a bite to eat with lunch and you don't know who they are and how they're ethically and morally constructed, you really end up with some sort of building trust-related issues. And S&OP requires an awful lot of openness and transparency and communication. And if you don't have trust, it's going to be very hard to have a meeting. There's also, you can't pick up on body language and visual cues. If someone's furrowing a brow or crossing their arms or pursing their lips, you know that they have either something that they want to say or they're disagreeing with you, or they're analyzing something, they're looking at something more deep. And those visual cues as an S&OP facilitator have always been very important for me to try and pick up. And you can't necessarily see that when you're on your opposite end of a webinar or a conference call talking about S&OP. The other problem is that you end up with people sitting on laptops and they're multitasking. They're full of external stimuli. You know, people are instant messaging them or whatever's going on, and they're not necessarily able to pay full attention. And you know, a lot of the S&OP content work is pretty deep dive and very specific and detailed. And if you're constantly being distracted by assorted external stimuli, that can't help the understanding in the meeting. It also creates a dependence on technology. Thank God this webinar seems to be going fine so far, but I've been on a lot of video conferences and conference calls where that wasn't the case. And one of the most destructive things in this whole process is the potential for sidebars, messengers, texts, and emails between a couple people in the room or a couple people in remote locations, you know, sort of talking about an issue off to the side. It's no different than someone having sort of sidebar conversations inside of a more formal meeting itself. You're going to want to try and, you know, get everyone talking, one person talking at a time, and getting all those opinions and points of view out on the floor. You can end up having sort of hidden conversations, back office conversations that inhibit collaboration, and that's really what you're trying to get to. So it really requires the S&OP facilitator to really step up and think differently. If you know it's a problem, I'm not sure, it took me a while to sort of pick up on that this was a real concern in S&OP meetings that I've been in and talking with peers. And I think you really have to step up, engage, and create much more of a team concept inside of that call and really pull from all participants. So things like walking around the room, sort of having a virtual walk or conversation around the room, asking everyone for their input, whether they're bought in, and forcing those sort of conversations becomes very important. How often you actually have a formal face-to-face meeting may or may not become important. You know, you may say we can do it virtual, you know, 6 months out of a year, but there's twice during the year when we have to sort of stop and meet and talk as a group, and maybe it's around a budget time frame or some other time frame, but there's certainly a need to sort of step in and engage more formally, probably a couple times a year. I think this is going to pose a problem as we get more and more remote, and the business trends continue to push us away from sort of a standard workplace and more into home offices and those sort of dynamics. Switching gears a little bit now, God, everyone screams about this. Volatility is such an enormous risk, and I can't tell you the number of people that have reached out to me personally, peers, and the number of times I've reached out to other people over the course of the last year and asked them about questions surrounding some sort of volatility related issue. Unplanned demand, supplier failures, and transportation disruptions are sort of at the top of the game. And E2Open did a survey, and I picked it up online, and it sort of talked about executives and what they were. I think it was the top 200 executives and where they felt the most risk and volatility was, and it was all an unplanned demand, which is very interesting and also at the same point in time not a surprise. And supplier failure was also not a surprise. As we get more global, we extend our supply chain timing and reach and length. I think supplier failures become much more of a concern. Certainly, it's one of those things that everyone wants to try and manage and be as risk adverse as possible. But I think people are still realizing you're not fully capable of doing that. Why? 100 different things. It could be political dynamics. Imagine if you had either a producing source or a selling location in Russia with all the geopolitical dynamics that have gone on in the last couple of years. I think that stifled a lot of business relationships to and from inside of those countries, and that's just one small example. Internally, when we were sort of much more local as a supply chain organizations, we would mask a lot of internal volatility with inventory. Inventory became the bomb to handle sort of all the chatter and all the noise and all the curves. whether the demand was volatile or we didn't forecast well, or we had suppliers that didn't reach their production attainment, or we had quality issues with supply or bottlenecks in our own capacity, we eventually learned how to manage it with inventory. It becomes much harder when you sort of lengthen the supply chain and get more global, and I don't know of anyone that hasn't gotten more global or aren't thinking more global in some way, shape, or form. And so the bomb of inventory isn't necessarily the answer anymore. I don't think that there's any surprise in anyone on the other side of this webinar that you can't just use inventory to solve the problems. There's a whole bunch of reasons why it's rising. Certainly, we have a much more global supply chain. Product complexity, even market to market, is getting much more difficult. You start looking at just rates of innovation and number of new products offered around the world, and they're growing in leaps and bounds. And I'll talk a little bit later that people's innovation funnels, which includes all sorts of transformative and extension products and things like that, are through the roof. There's so much heightened turbulence in the supply chain, war, weather, currency. Anyone who made any sort of currency bets with Canadian dollar and US dollars on some side of it, plus or minus right now. Outsourcing, as the more and more we outsource, and I have a slide in a couple that we'll talk about how much we're outsourcing more. We keep on pushing the outsourcing model, and as we do, we start losing more and more control over our own destiny, and that of and by itself can pose issues. Regulatory movements around the world, whether it's people are trying to ban BPAs, or we've already banned lead pretty much in most places around the world, but it seems like every other day there's another initiative, another green initiative to ban more chemicals, and I think it's becoming more of a problem, not less. And there's a whole host of other local factors that are creating volatility, both on the demand and the supply side. Anyone that was in the U.S. and the supply chain in the U.S., particularly more on the execution side, when the snowstorm Thor hit the middle of the country, it completely disrupted a whole bunch of carrier supply chains, and people who were served Walmart were getting horrendous MABDs, like 60% MABD. It was really horrific for about 3 or 4 months, and we had sort of stretched the capacity of a carrier network with the hours of service rules, and it was tremendously disruptive. There's been, in the U.S. again, multiple port congestion problems, labor disputes at ports. There's so many other local factors that are extending lead times, or adding a lot of chatter on the delivery side, on raw ingredients and things like that. Supply chain volatility exists everywhere, and countless examples, and I can think of a dozen that have happened inside of my own business. So you start looking at what are the people that are really digging in, really surveying, really talking to chief supply chain officers around the country. What type of insight are they deriving? And Laura Ciceri put together this slide, and it's really pretty wonderful, and it sort of describes what was important 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, we were all talking about supply chain visibility. And now, sort of going left to right, we're now really focused on operations complexity, regulatory compliance, and demand volatility is one of those things that keeps on keeping on in terms of it's very much front of mind. This is where supply chain executives are seeing risk. It's where risk is truly being realized each and every day. So what's causing it? 100 different events, 100 different decision points. But some of it I think we're doing to ourselves. And you start thinking about the amount of outsourcing that's happening inside a business, and you start looking at how much of our businesses are now moving to an outsourced model. And in some cases, you have less than 50% of manufacturing or final assembly configuration or warehousing and transportation insourced, and that becomes problematic. You really do start losing control and managing your own risk inside of those models. You just become, who pays me the most money to get the product out the door? And I think anytime you can take anything, you can swing the pendulum too far either way, and we may be hitting the point where we've swung it too far the other way, and we have to start thinking about optimal supply chain design, which is probably some morphing of an outsource insource model versus a pure outsource. So we've created, in some cases, the problem ourselves. So how are people talking about they manage it? Again, I'm talking about my conversations with my peer groups, and a lot of them are paying attention to unplanned demand more than ever before, because demand side volatility really becomes important when your response is muted because you've extended your supply chain so long. Expecting bad things to happen should be part of the S&OP process, and this is where, you know, essentially focus on planning for extremes of volatility. What happens if my new product launch exceeds my expectations by 25%? I'm starting to see an awful lot of writing, and I'm really pleased by it, and hopefully it really pushes into implementation in S&OP process, where people are talking about scenario planning, control towers, and playbooks and guideposts. How can I pre-plan to react to a potential situation? I already have my game plan laid out. It's sort of like, yeah, you know, if the Jets do nothing but blitz this weekend, how are the Redskins going to handle it? Well, I'm sure Gruden from the Redskins knows exactly how he's going to handle if the Jets blitz this weekend. Forgive me for showing my fandom here. Measuring a potential risk area makes a difference. If global supplier, as an example, fails to reach attainment on a regular basis, you have to sort of manage and address that issue. What's not happening though, and it's one of the first questions I ask when someone says I have a supplier problem, I ask whether they're measuring them or not, and most are not measuring enough. And I think you can only playbook or game plan or control tower or guidepost if you're actually planning in bands, and if you think that way. And this has always been a best practice. As a matter of fact, the next slide is Dick Ling, and Dick Ling is the man that invented the term S&OP. And he's always talked about the myth of not one number, and there's sort of what you're saying you're planning, but there's also ranges on either side of it, high and low, of what the potential is or may not be. And you have to take sort of that band and plan. It's really, your plan is an integrated set of numbers. It's plus or minus. It's not 100. It's plus or minus 5 off the 100. And Dick loves this slide. If you give Dick 20 minutes, he'll talk about this slide nonstop. And it's really instructive for me because it's one of those things how I learned how to think about supply chain planning. And really, you start. I found this online, and I thought it was a wonderful example slide. You start with ranging a forecast, and then you range your supply, and you try and figure out what that means, and you make the best decisions from there. So this whole idea of guideposting or control towering or playbooking really requires that you think of bands both on the demand and the supply side. Most people don't think of banding on the supply side. Most people will band on the demand side. I thought this was a wonderful, instructive slide and very, very helpful in trying to convey the thought. There's two other sort of, you know, what's happening next in the S&OP world. Where is it extending to? And S&OP will continue to look much more outward. Are we going to be market-driven? Yes. Will it happen overnight? No. I think it's taken us a long time to get to some level of critical mass at a relatively low maturity level. I think we're going to be pushed more and more into a market-driven model, but I'm not sure we're going to get there in the next 10 years. If we are, some of the best will be doing it, but I'm not sure there'll be a lot of people doing it. And so this whole market-driven model is another one of those supply chain insights, Laura Cesari models, and I really like it because it really, on the left side, the sort of the enterprise, the inside-out focus. It's the sort of traditional S&OP. It's a relatively mature. You could say that you're sort of you're all grown up on the left side, and as you start looking outside and you try and sense and shape demand, and then move to orchestrate demand much more, you become really grown up. You become a very mature S&OP process. Now, I think Laura has done a wonderful job of graphically depicting kind of where we are now and where we could be going. And I think most companies that are doing S&OP exist somewhere between sales-driven and business planning-driven. I'm not sure anyone's doing a great job. Maybe the top 10% are really doing a job of sensing and shaping demand. And I think that's probably the next hurdle. And you see people out there really trying to explore that. I know that's happening, but I'm not sure we're there just yet. All of this is going to be facilitated by big data, by customers wanting it their way, sort of the Burger King, you can have it your way. Think of Amazon thinking about using drones to drop a package off, 1 or 2 hours after you actually order it online. It just amazes me. There used to be a gentleman I worked with, Rich Sherman, when I worked at Numetrics, and he would talk about getting a beer at the speed of thought. You say, I want a Corona or I want a Heineken, and literally it just sort of appears in your face. And some of what we're trying to do to extend and tighten up delivery on the back end is just amazing. And it really is almost demand at the speed of thought. I think we're moving into a different era of the consumer, an era when the consumer gets their own way. And I think it's going to be very important that we have an understanding of what that consumer wants. The last major theme is that service-based S&OP will emerge. And a lot of APICS people say, well, why does this matter to me? There's service organizations inside of a lot of manufacturing companies, so I think it does matter. This is sort of undiscovered country in supply chain planning. It's not to say that it hasn't been done. I actually did a survey of 10 different organizations, and I found 10 different service organizations with pretty modest, strong planning processes that in some way, shape, or form resembled S&OP, but it hasn't been formalized. And it really comes down to how you visualize supply and demand. And instead of product families, you have service groups or service families, and it becomes very easy to sort of translate it. And I saw examples in consulting, corrections, school systems, banks, and hospitals, which I thought were amazing. And I sat and I looked at a software package the other day, and while I was sort of going through a review of it, they put up this slide, and I thought it was a very interesting slide because you start looking at some of the problem sets that exist inside of a service industry: low skill, mix, forecast accuracy, unreliable source and availability, suboptimal allocations. This is kind of classic supply chain jargonese. It feels like this is one of those things that's going to pop and emerge. I know that there's people out there doing it. Bob Stahl dropped me a note and said that there was someone, again, another pioneer in the S&OP world, and he said there's a software company that he's been working with that is doing essentially a people version of S&OP. If your organization, if your manufacturing organization also has a service entity, I think that this is one of those things that might actually be helpful as we go forward. There's a whole bunch of other trends, and I said how many trends are there, and how many can you actually talk about and put more than 4 or 5 bullet points to? There's a couple 1 or 2 bullet point items that really deserve at least a peripheral conversation. Innovation funnels are absolutely huge right now, and those people that seem to be managing them well are doing some version of a portfolio management process inside of S&OP. They're actually doing that step, and with interlace, staging gate type of processes, and those that are doing it, it's sort of the difference between, it's always going to cause you some amount of indigestion. So it's the difference between sort of agita and ulcers. If you really don't embrace portfolio management step inside of S&OP, you're probably going to end up with the ulcers. The other next big bullet point, and it is big, but I don't know how to add much more on top of the single bullet point, is that the SEM talent pool is weakening. Certainly, the early supply chain practitioners are retiring, and big data and the need for internal quant folks is just a giant sucking sound on our profession. Investment in internal development and employee retention is unbelievably important. Hard skills developments, classic seminal books. It's there. If you're not sending, if you're a manager in the supply chain space and you're not sending your people away to 2 or 3 courses per year and not developing them, then you're going to fall behind, because you're going to start losing any of your experienced talent really quick. You're much better off keeping and retaining and keeping them engaged. It's a big problem, and there's some people. Andrea Atwell at L'Oreal has conceptualized how to do this better. I mean, there's people out there putting good thinking into how to embrace this challenge. But this is one of those conversation points at every conference I attend. So I know it's not just an issue that I see in my peer groups. I know lots of people are talking about it. I think there's going to be a move towards internal benchmarking. I think we've spent an awful lot of time saying, here's what the Maybearer should be inside of CPG, or here's what the number of inventory turns should be inside of this industry. And there is no harmony between different entities. It's, we are probably a 90% in-house manufacturing company where I work right now. And I work for companies that were 60-40, and we have peers that are 90% outsourced. It's hard to compare an inventory target. It's hard to compare when someone serves Walmart and doesn't serve Walmart. So it really becomes a very difficult model to compare yourself to any benchmark. I think what's going to happen is we're going to have to all learn to compare ourselves to what we can do best. That requires some of that math and quant talent internally to develop those models to say, here is our best opportunity, and let's set that up as a target. One last point, and I think the Internet of Things is going to provide demand signals, and we probably won't get to see this in the next 10 years, but I think it's going to be on the edge of the next 10 years that we can't even imagine right now. People talked about big data forever. I think the Internet of Things is going to imagine having a Whirlpool refrigerator and having a pump go in it, and having a refrigerator smart enough to know, connect into the Internet through some way or protocol, and inform their corporate headquarters that there's going to be a call on that part. And that would be absolutely amazing. And it's kind of a lame example, but it's illustrative in sort of the power of the Internet of Things. I think it's going to push big data behind the wildest expectations. Imagine knowing how many times a day and how you can design a product. How many times a day someone opens a refrigerator door or the freezer door. I mean, things, usage studies that you can't even otherwise imagine are now available. I have a very smart car, and my car knows an awful lot of, my car knows what's going on and ends up informing somehow. I don't even know how. The dealership, because I'm getting all sorts of notices exactly as my due dates are due. So that's it. That's what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing. I'm not sure whether there's no seer in me. It's really me just translating and hearing what I get from having my ear to the rail a bit, and not much more than that. So with that, I'm not sure if there's any questions out there.
Well, thank you, Patrick. As promised, we have saved time for questions and answers. As a reminder, look at the right toolbar on your screen, type your question in the questions box, and click send. And we'll now give you a few moments to send in your questions. Okay, Patrick, our first question is there one software solution that's better than another for S&OP?
I think there's a lot of different software solutions out there that some of them are well branded and well named, and they have niche opportunities. I don't want to, I mean, I almost said I don't want to endorse any of them in my slide, because I think some of them do it well. I think it's a case by case. I think you have to define your requirements. I sketched out what most people are kind of looking for, I think. And I think you have to go talk to the software companies and bring them in and solicit. And there's people really pushing the envelope, and I hope that, you know, there's not a lot of gobbling up of these software companies. I hope they remain out there so they fight and they compete well.
Thank you. Our next question is, why is the innovation funnel growing, and how does one manage it within S&OP, and where are the connection points?
Well, you know, I alluded to this a bit. I think portfolio management is the place where it connects, and the portfolio management step really covers everything from ideation to commercialization and launch, and then it covers the complete product life cycle. So it sort of takes a new product out of the hole, as it were, but it also does post-launch analysis. So you're constantly tracking new products after they've launched to see if there's any learnings there as you go through the process again in the future. It provides information to other process steps. It provides forecasts and supply requirements and things like that. If you need line time for a pilot, that's where that information is passed in and out of. But the portfolio management step also covers the renovation projects that are going on. And some of the as companies are trying to get much more gritty in the marketplace, much tougher in the marketplace, and they're competing for that very, very last dollar, the amount of innovation, whether it's extending lines or putting an IRC on or whatever, new pack outs, price fighter SKUs, the amount of stuff that's going on right now is amazing. And so that's why the funnel is growing, and you leverage that inside of the portfolio management step. I'll also tell you something else that's driving an awful lot of change, and that's all the sustainability efforts. So people are redoing packaging and redoing formulations on both sustainability and regulatory stuff that's really popping up right now. A lot of people are trying to get their chemistry right, especially anyone that serves a consumer sector, because chemistry is becoming front of mind in many consumers' minds. People are reformulating around safer chemicals. So.
Great. Are you seeing any S&OP programs in colleges today?
There's a few. There's people that teach it, but there's not a lot. And they tend to be in schools that either have robust supply chain management programs, and there's a few of those, or with a professor or two that has a specific interest in the subject matter.
Got it. And what resources do you recommend for people who are just starting out with S&OP?
There's a ton of books. There's public courses. You know, start with orchestrating success and move from there. Um, I, I, I think I think you get the benefit. I mean, there's public courses out there on S&OP offered by consulting companies of all types and shapes. I think you get the benefit in a public course of working and talking to peers. And I can't encourage people enough. If you want to learn, go to a conference, whether it's an APICS conference or an IBF conference. APICS does a wonderful best of the best conference. I think it's in Chicago most years, sort of at the beginning of the summer. That it is you just sort of sit there and take a survey of S&OP learning, and you'll find out everything: how people manage risk, how people scenario plan, what are the best metrics. The conversation inside of those conferences are wonderful.
Thank you. Our next question is, what should a good S&OP model look like?
There's always demand. There's always a demand review process. There's mostly, in most businesses, a supply balancing process where you review, you take demand as an input and you rough cut capacity plan it, and you see what your supply capabilities are, and you rebalance them out. You have an integrated reconciliation process or a pre-S&OP meeting, and in that meeting you're talking about issues and problems that are surfacing either on the demand or supply side, and you have an executive review meeting where you ask for agreement and consensus around the plan. You also ask for direction and strategy, and you put a value to the forecast and a value to the supply plan. Again, it's S&OP. I always joke that I try and explain to my mother what I do with regard to S&OP, and it's virtually impossible. It's a complex process that touches the organization. I will add this: one of the things I love about being an S&OP lead or facilitator is I feel like a catcher on a baseball team. I get to see the entire field. I'm in on every play, and being able to sense and understand what's happening on the demand side, to know what's happening and how we're going to fill on the supply side, and what it means from a valuation perspective, what it means to the business in terms of top line and bottom line, is enormously gratifying.
Thanks. Now, going back to the S&OP meetings, how often should those take place?
It's a good question. It's one of those classic debates. The standard process answer is there's a monthly cadence to all those meetings. There's people that think that it should be done more frequently. In businesses specifically that operate mostly with short product life cycles, high technology companies, fashion companies, they believe that it should be done more often. What S&OP is, what the S&OP meeting is a once per month snapshot of what you're planning going forward. There's dynamic planning inside of the supply chain all the time. So I'm not sure S&OP ever really stops. I think there's always that conversation. You're always looking at whether you're overcommitting to your forecast or not. You're always checking your production attainment against plan dynamically within a month and adjusting and making changes. Production lines go down. You get unplanned demand. So those dynamics happen all the time, which may require you to sort of sit and process something off to the side. But most S&OP processes exist with a monthly cadence.
Thank you. And Randy asks, how important is the CEO role in the process, or can the lower management levels be the only members involved?
You know, the CEO is really important. Having top-level, top-down belief in the system and in the process is tremendously valuable. I worked at Snapple, and the CEO publicly said it's his most valuable meeting of the month because it gave him a true understanding of what was happening operationally. He understood what our plan was, how that balanced out against what we were otherwise expecting from a budgetary perspective, where we had supply constraints. He found it enormously valuable. I think you have to create a meeting that's valuable to the CEO to get their attendance there. You have to bring decisions to the meeting that are CEO level decisions to keep them engaged. I think it's very important. Now, the title CEO is up for grabs. It could be a general manager of a business and not necessarily the CEO. It could be the president of a business and not the CEO. So I think the titling is sort of suspect. I think it's the highest person that controls the supply and demand decisions of an entity that should be in the meeting. It's very important.
Thank you. Manuel asks, what challenges do you see for managers in supply chain to keep track of new challenges and retain employees?
What challenges do I see?
Yes.
I think there's always that opportunity that if you're not developing and maturing a talent inside of your own supply chain disciplines, they're going to want to go somewhere else where they can get more professionally developed or more actualized or more money. So I think it's making sure that you pay people legitimately and competitively and keep on developing them so that they feel that they're growing and expanding their opportunity. I don't think the model for how you retain employees is different than how you'd retain any employee in any profession. I think that there's a reality that there's a giant sucking sound of all the typical quant talent that would go into the supply chain, into other disciplines now. It's really being pulled hard, and I think we have to acknowledge that and do what we can right now to try and retain that talent.
Thank you. Brett asks, I've always thought of S&OP as more of a balancing act between supply and demand, but you mentioned scenario planning. Can you expand on this, and to what extent do you take the scenarios?
Well, scenario planning is great for two things. It's great to manage risk on new product introductions, and it's great to manage risk on your overall supply chain. Imagine a new product introduction and not having enough capacity to meet unplanned demand. You want to make sure that you have figured out and hedged so that you can manage the upside. You also want to understand how you track on the downside. Scenario planning is taking demand, matching it against supply, and figuring out what the trade-offs. So it is a balancing act. They're not mutually exclusive terms.
Great, and I think we have time for one more question. Stephen asks, you talked about the challenges with global S&OP meetings with not having interpersonal contact. Do you see most companies optimizing their S&OP on a global or regional level given these challenges?
Again, I think it's a mixed model. I've seen 100 different ways and approaches. Some of them use a center of excellence that drives the conversation about what it should look like, but they allow people in regions to manage their own business. Sometimes there's a sort of a corporate planning function that manages it, but supply and demand are computed regionally. I mean, there's all different models. I think it really depends on the go-to-market and the production and distribution network and demand network of the individual company. I don't think there's a standard answer for that question. I hate to be a weasel, but there's no standard answer to that question, unfortunately.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That's all the questions we have time for today. Patrick, could you advance to the last slide, please? So for those of you who didn't have your questions answered, or if you have more questions, you can feel free to reach out to Patrick at the email address on your screen. We'd like to thank our speaker and all of the participants for their time today. This concludes today's edition of APICS Extra Live. All content and materials included in this edition of APICS Extra Live are the property of APICS and Patrick Bauer and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved. Thank you for joining us.